without any further delay, let's welcome Dr. Dan Bowen.
Thank you very much. I appreciate you having me here today. I'm more of a storyteller than I am a lecturer, so I'm not sure what kind of a lecture you're going to get today. I spend most of my days listening and not talking, so if I kind of get distracted after a while, you'll know I'm listening rather than talking. But I'm kind of interested, before I get too far, to know who am I speaking to? Who are the students here? Okay. And who are the staff? And who are faculty? We got a kind of a mix, so we got a little mix, okay? Little mix of things. So, okay, that helps me kind of orient myself a little bit. I'll just give you a little bit more background so you kind of know maybe a little bit more where I'm coming from. Upon graduation from Purdue, I spent about a year at Iowa State University in the Student Counseling Center working with students there as doing an internship. And that was a good experience for me to kind of get a sense of where students live and feel. But unfortunately, that was 1985, so that was a couple years ago. And students may have changed a little bit since then. In fact, I'm sure they have. Then I spent about 10 years in South Dakota, initially in a mental health center for about a year and a half, and then I spent the rest of the time in private practice in South Dakota, worked with a lot of different populations there, including the Native Americans, which was kind of an interesting population to work with in the portion of South Dakota where we were located. And in 1995, came back to Fort Wayne, Indiana at the bequest of Avalon Missionary Church, who asked us to come back and set up a counseling center, which we did on the south side of Fort Wayne. And I was there for a period of time at Avalon Christian Counseling Center, and then we set up a satellite office in Auburn and had a counselor up there for a while. And then when he retired, I started going back and forth and eventually spent all my time in Auburn, have for the last several years. And I do have a counselor in Fort Wayne, Diane Stitzer, who is at Avalon Christian Counseling on St. Mary's, which is housed in a church, and I'm housed in a little office there in Auburn. So I spend most of my days doing counseling or disability evaluations. So it's about half and half. The mornings I typically do disability evaluations, which are people that are sent to me from the state of Indiana who have mental or emotional issues and think that they might have the need for assistance. And in the afternoon, I typically do individual counseling or marriage counseling or work with adults primarily, some teenagers, and refer them to children elsewhere. And so that's kind of how I spend my days or my time. I'm going to try to probably get into the meat here in a few minutes, tell a few stories, and then I would like to open up more primarily for questions and give you more time for questions, because I tend to do a little bit better in an interactive mode than in a lecture mode. I get kind of tired of hearing myself speak very quickly. And so I don't want to have you subjected to the same torture that I am. So we'll kind of move in that direction. But I did want to tell you, I found out Ben was a history professor here, and that just tickled me, because one of the stories that I wanted to tell up front is actually a history professor story. And it's from my early days when I was a student at Huntington College, which is what it was known at the time. And it was the first year that I was there, which would have been about 1968, 1969. And I had a professor there named Dr. Brooks. And Dr. Brooks not only taught history, but she had lived quite a bit of history. And so I think Dr. Brooks at that time was probably in her late 70s or early 80s. And the History of Civilization course that I took at the time was housed in the top of the administration building there, in a kind of an auditorium that was also used sometimes for plays and so forth. It housed about 100, maybe 125 people altogether. And you had to walk up 3 flights of stairs to get to this old auditorium. And if you've been to old auditoriums, you know what I'm talking about, or you have the old wooden boards that you pull out and you write on, and you sit in these old wooden chairs that are not very comfortable. And Dr. Brooks would stand down in the front, and she would lecture. But you would hear Dr. Brooks come up because there's no elevator, And it's amazing to me that at her age she could do this, up 3 flights of stairs, because she was a fairly stout woman, to get to the top of that auditorium to lecture. And unfortunately, History of Civilization was for 2 semesters, and it started every morning at 7:30, which I don't know about you, but I'm not a very good historian at 7:30 in the morning. I'm not a very good historian at 7:30 at night, but I'm certainly not a very good historian at 7:30 in the morning. And so Dr. Brooks would come up the stairs, and we would hear her come, and there were probably about 100 of us in this auditorium, students that were there kind of trying to keep our eyes open with great big orange History of Civilization books. And Dr. Brooks would come up the stairs, and she'd walk across the front of the auditorium. And she would stand on a wooden box podium, which is really instrumental to my story here in just a minute. And she'd put up a metal lectern on that wooden box podium, and then she would put her History of Civilization book down, and she'd open it, and she'd lean on her arms, and she'd look around the class at the students. And then in a voice that I could only describe as a voice that you really couldn't listen to and you couldn't not listen to. It's kind of like one of those where you're almost like in suspended animation. She'd say, "Good morning, class." Oh, my goodness. And then she would proceed to lecture for the next 50 minutes. And this went on 4 mornings a week for the first semester, and we were into the second semester. And one night, the 2 roommates of myself, Charlie and Bill and myself, got the wild idea that this course was kind of getting to us a little bit, and we need to shake it up just a little bit. So we hit on the bright idea of taking travel alarms. And each of us had a travel alarm, a little travel alarm where you wind up. Back then, today it's all digital, but back then you'd wind up and you let it go, and it would ring for about a minute. And we set the travel alarms to go off at about 5-minute intervals, beginning at about 5 till 8, 8, and 8:05. And we went up the night before, and we put them under the wooden box podium. And the next morning, Dr. Brooks got up and came up 3 flights of stairs, walked across, stood on the podium, and said, "Good morning, class," and started the lecture. And the rest of us promptly kind of fell into a state of suspended animation until about 5 till 8, when the first travel alarm went off. And when it went off, those things ring for a minute, and under the wooden box podium, which amplified the sound, you could not tell where that was coming from. And so we all looked around the room to try to figure out what was going on. None of us had a clue what was happening at this point in time. Well, Dr. Brooks she's an old veteran, and she just stood there, and she kind of waited and rolled her eyes, and pretty soon the alarm stopped, and she was so sharp. She just said, we were in World War II, and she just said, "And Europe sounded the alarm." I thought, wow, that's quick. We'll see how she does with the second, because the second came up 4 minutes later. And it rang for another minute, and we all looked around the room trying to figure out where it was coming from. We couldn't figure it out. She rolled her eyes again, and then she said, "Class dismissed." It was only 20 minutes, but we would take it. So that's my history lesson for the day. Nobody heard the third alarm. We went to get the alarms clocks later on, which is kind of the end of the story, and we crept up the back stairs only to find the dean and students of Dr. Brooks sitting in the front row. Needless to say, we crept back down the stairs and got him another day, because we were not going to face the wrath of the dean and students of Dr. Brooks that day. The point of that story, though, is we all kind of do things sometimes, and we do it sometimes and we don't even know why we do it. Have you kind of found yourselves in that position where you do something or you say something, and at the time it sounds like a good idea or fun or interesting, or you do it and you don't even know why you said that, or you walk away from a conversation or a relationship, and you've just said something to somebody and you think, why did I say that? I found myself in that situation many times where I figure, like, why did I do that? You know, I could have done that so much better. I could have said that so much better. I did or said something that I know they took offense with or hurt their feelings or didn't further the relationship or tore the fabric of it. Why is it that I did that? There was a little experiment that was done. It was kind of interesting. It's recounted in the book, The Hidden Brain. Anybody familiar with The Hidden Brain? Okay. It's recounted in the book, The Hidden Brain. I'd pronounce the author's name, but I would butcher it. He's on NPR. He does a podcast called The Hidden Brain, which is social science research, and he recounts this little experiment. It's kind of interesting. What he recounts is there is this little coffee place, which is an honor coffee place in a organization. It could be like this organization or any organization, and it's honor coffee. So what that means is nobody's going to have a coffee machine and nobody's going to attend to the coffee, but somebody has to pay for the coffee. So the way this works is there's a little money box there, and you're just supposed to throw in some money, and you get your coffee, and you get your cream, and you get your cups, and away you go. And the way they fund this thing is from the money you throw in the cup. And so they're assuming that they're going to break even. They're not trying to make money. It's just a way to help the employees or the staff or whoever's in this organization. And so they monitored this money situation for a while to see how close they were breaking even. And they just kind of did a baseline. And then they did an interesting experiment. There was a sign up above that said, "This is the honor system. Please throw your money in the cup to pay for the coffee. We're not making any money, but we need to have money in order to break even." So that's what they did. But they made two signs. Now, the first sign looked just like the second sign, with one little exception. The first sign had little flowers, little daisies, up in the right-hand corner. You could almost not hardly see them. They're just little daisies, like a little imprint. And the second sign had two eyes in the upper right-hand corner. There was no camera. There's no monitoring, just two eyes. And then they monitored to see what would happen with the coffee money. What do you think happened? The weeks that they had the two eyes poster, the coffee money went up. The weeks when they didn't, the coffee money went down. When they asked people later on about the signs, nobody knew there was a different sign. No one realized that there was a sign that had two eyes posted two daisies. It was happening in the hidden brain, in the back of the brain, the part of the brain, the kind of the subconscious, the heart of the person, which is kind of what we're going to address a little bit today. I kind of like you to think about the brain a little bit today like an automobile. And we're going to put 3 passengers in that automobile. Now, this may not be quite scientifically accurate, but it's metaphorically accurate for my description today, so you'll have to kind of bear with me, if you will. In the front part of the brain on the left-hand side, in an area that we call the prefrontal cortex, we're going to put a person there. We're going to call him the driver, or her the driver, depending upon if you're him or her. And what your driver does, that's the person that makes the decisions. So on a daily basis, as you kind of go through the day, that's kind of the computer in your brain. And that's the person that thinks about things, tends to be pretty logical, tends to be pretty analytical, tends to be pretty rational. We think speech is housed pretty close to that. And so behavior, free will, the adult part of who you are, in fact, the part that I'm talking to today, is housed in that part of the brain. And when you're not under stress, when things are going well, you tend to do very well. Under stress, other drivers, other automobiles, other people, other brains coming at you, you begin to have to drive in heavy traffic. And the heavier the traffic is, the harder it is to behave in a way that you might want to behave, because you're having to make multiple decisions as the stimuli increases. So external stress can be a factor to that part of the brain, as well as internal stress can, which we'll look at in just a minute. And so that part of the brain does very well, behaves very well in kind of a non-stressed, a non-fatigued, a non-ill, or a non-disabled format. But under those other situations, it can become confused and irrational. We also believe that a lot of the mental illnesses or the mental disorders might actually be contributed up there, like schizophrenia or even autism or whatever. But the point is that part of the brain is your adult part. It's your driver. Are you with me so far? Okay. Next to your driver, on the right-hand side, you have a navigator. Now, your navigator has your road map. Your roadmap would be considered like your conscience, your belief systems, your values, all those things that sit over on that side. And the navigator sits there and it looks at the roadmap. And it talks to your driver. So you have this little internal dialogue going on in your brain during the course of the day. And what happens is you're interacting with people. You have this little person, he or she sitting over there, coaching you, sometimes parenting you, navigating, kind of telling you what you should or shouldn't say, or what you should or shouldn't do, or how you should or shouldn't behave. Are you following me? You've got this little person over there, this little navigator, that's communicating to your driver where your beliefs are housed, trying to influence your driver. Now, it doesn't have the ability to control the behavior because the driver controls the behavior. The brakes, the gas, the steering wheel is with the driver. If you've ever sat in the passenger seat, and I'm sure all of you had at one time, and you've been in a car with somebody who's driving, and you wonder, are they paying attention? Have you ever done this where your foot hits the floor and you're braking? I remember and each of my children were learning how to drive, I about put my foot through the floor on the right-hand side. They all turned out to be good drivers, but when they were 16, 17, 18 years of age, and we were learning in that learning process, I wasn't sure all of us were going to make it. I recount one time when my son, he's now over 30, he's got kids, or some of my grandkids, so I have to speak well of him, so he lets me continue to see him. But I remember when we were out and we were on our way to church one Sunday morning, and we were heading down Spy Run Road, and it was a little icy, and Mom was in the back seat, and I was in the navigator seat. And at that point in time, his mom said to him, as moms are wont to do, I think you and I just slow down a little bit. And his response, being a normal teenage response, was, Mom, I got this. At which point, he hit a nice patch and did a 360. And we went up over the back embankment and down toward the river there on Spy Run Avenue. We didn't go in, but we're pointing down. And he's sitting there like this. And I'm sitting there like this. And I said, would you like to switch seats? He said, please. So we backed out and went to church. But if you've been in that navigator seat, or that person is in your navigator seat, you know what I'm talking about. Your navigator's trying to influence you how to behave, but it can't control your behavior. And so frequently you'll find yourself doing something, and then afterwards you're thinking, why did I do that? Now that'd be nice. That's your executive system, and that would be nice if that's all there was to it. But we've got to add some other pieces. And the next piece that we're going to add is the kid in the back seat, which all of us have. And the kid in the back seat sits there, and he or she is sitting in front of the surround sound movie theater, which we might call the hippocampus. And what he or she sees are these eidetic images, which are stored at the cellular level. They're little DVDs that are encrypted. They're stored at the cellular level, and he can see them or she can see them, and they play. And these are all the movies or memories of the past. They're stored. Each of you and I have these significant emotional events that are encoded and that can play at any time. We may not be aware of them in the front seat, but the kid's aware of them in the back seat. And the kid can see the front seat, he or she can see the movies. They can also see outside, but their perceptual set is different because it's more of looking at it as a child than as an adult. And so that whole limbic system now comes into play in the back seat. So the emotions are housed back there. Anger, fear, joy are housed back there. The kid doesn't necessarily speak in words, but he or she speaks in emotions and images and communicates through emotions and images to the front seat. And how does he or she communicate? Hijacks the car. What happens is, when you have an experience where the adrenaline begins to kick up and it comes right up through the amygdala, there's a nerve endings that go to the back of the brain and the front of the brain, shorter nerve to the back where the kid sits, longer nerve to the front where the adults are. The emergency brake's in the back where the kid is. Weird design car, right? But he or she can pull the emergency brake, and all of a sudden you feel like you're out of control. And now you're starting to say and do things that you don't really want to say or do. Give you an example. Several years ago, when Obama was running for president the first time, I did all the adult things that you're supposed to do. The front of my brain seemed to be working fairly well at that time, to my knowledge. Later on in the day, not so much. But at that time, it worked so well. And so what did I do? I scheduled the time to go vote. I read up on who was running, the candidates. I knew what the issues were. I studied the ballot. I spent my time getting ready. I put it on my calendar so that I wouldn't have counseling sessions. I was ready to go. The night before I was to go to vote, my kid in the back seat went nutsy-fagging on me. And if you've had this experience, which I'm sure you've had, your kid goes nuts and you don't know why. But he or she didn't want me to go vote. Now, it'd be nice if he could communicate in nice, articulate words. I don't think it's a good idea for you to vote, and this is the reason that I'd like you not to go to vote. No, it was just this overwhelming feeling of anxiety that I had all of a sudden. Like, you can't vote, you can't go, you can't do it. Now, if you try to argue with the kid in the back seat, you don't tend to get very far. Have you ever tried to argue with a child throwing a temper tantrum, or ever tried to reason with a child throwing a temper? You know what I'm talking about? You just can't. You could distract them maybe, but you have to kind of let them burn out because there's not a whole lot you can do right at that moment. And that's the way with our kids in the back seat. When they throw that temper tantrum, they're really believing that for some reason, their life, which happens to be our life since they reside in us, is dependent upon our paying attention. And so he threw that temper tantrum. And I knew enough by that time not to argue with him. I said, okay, fine, I won't go to vote. In which time he quieted down and got quiet. It's great, so I could sleep. So the next morning I get up and I go vote. Now I'm standing in the voting line, and if you've ever stood in the voting line, you know there's not a whole lot to do in a voting line. I mean, you're just waiting. They're just waiting. That was a long voting line. And I'm thinking, I could kind of like to know, what was that about last night? Haven't you had those experiences where you kind of like to know, why did I do that? Why did I feel that way? Why did I think that way? Well, what? I mean, that doesn't make any sense to me. That's not me. That's not who I am. That's not what I wanted to do. I had all this ready to go, and that happened. What's going on? Why am I feeling that way? Well, that's what I wanted to do. Why do I feel that way? So I'm standing in the voting line, and hopefully nobody can see what I'm thinking, because they would have probably escorted me out at that point in time. I'm having a conversation with my multiple selves, and I'm saying to the kid, what was that about? Now, when you talk to the kid in the back, you can't really just talk like that, because he doesn't really understand. Or she doesn't understand. You have to show him pictures or images or whatever. So I'm showing pictures of last night, the night before. What was that about? And if you be sensitive, if you listen, the hidden brain or the subconscious or the heart, as it's referred to in Scripture, will start to give you responses, which will not make any sense. And that's what happened. He started showing me my life's most embarrassing moments. Things that happened in the past that was very embarrassing, publicly humiliating, a fate worse than death. And so as he's showing me these moments, I'm thinking, well, that's great, but what does that have to do with the price of tea in China? What does that have to do with voting? Now, you have to kind of know something about the kid in the back. He is not linearly time-oriented. The front of the brain is linearly time-oriented. It thinks yesterday, today, or tomorrow. The kid in the back is organically time-oriented. So anything that has happened, as far as he's concerned, is still happening. For example, I'll come back to the kid in just a minute. Several years ago, I was working with a lady who came in. She's 38 years old, and she can't drive. She's driven since age of 16 to age 38, but she can't drive. Every time she goes to drive her car, she goes to hit the gas, she has a panic attack. She literally freezes up. She locks. She can't drive her car. Can't make herself do it. Goes to the doctor. Says, doctor, I can't drive my car. He gives her some medication. Here's some anti-anxiety medication. This should help your panic attacks. She takes it. Goes to drive. Can't drive her car. Goes to a behavior therapist. He says, we're going to desensitize you. We're going to work through all this. We're going to desensitize you so you can drive your car. Can't drive her car. She comes in. I can't drive my car. So we begin to look at, is there a reason that you can't drive your car? Nothing on the surface. You're physically healthy. There's no reason. You've been driving since age 16. You're 30 years old. Why can't you drive your car? And as we began to look at what was going on, what we realized is she had a little movie that kept playing from the time she was 3 years old. And when she was 3 years old, she was riding in the car with her uncle and her aunt, and she's in the back seat, and they go around a fairly high rate of speed, and she's thrown from the car. And she skids on the pavement, and she spends 2 weeks in the hospital. So what does that have to do with not driving the car today? That little memory, for some reason, lay dormant till she's 38 years old. Something triggered that movie to play at age 38. We don't know why, don't have a clue. But it was in there, it's embedded, it's in her heart, it's in her subconscious, and it plays, and when it played, it was protecting her because that part of the brain does not think linearly, it thinks organically. Anything that has happened is actually still happening right now or could happen. And so it was protecting her from a fate worse than death. It was protecting her from actually dying or being thrown from the car. Logically, she knew. She's a rational adult. She knew that I'm fine. I knew that if I went to vote, I'm not running for public office. Nobody's going to assassinate me. I'm just standing in line to vote. What could be embarrassing about voting? And so I've got to now kind of put it together. And that's what we do with the front of the brain. We try to make sense of the back of the brain. Why am I behaving? And a lot of times we offer examples or excuses or explanations that may or may not make any sense, but we do that because social grace causes us. Why did you act that way? Why did you say that? Why did you do that? The reason I said that, the reason I did that, it has to do with the economy. It has to do with the economy. No, it has to do with left turn signals. I mean, we come up with some kind of an explanation that we can live with, but oftentimes we have no clue why we behave or do what we do, which is what we'll come to in a minute as we continue to kind of expand on this. So I'm thinking, okay, why? What's going on? Help me make the connection here. And as I'm thinking, what could be embarrassing about voting? And as I begin to think about it, here's what I came up with. Whether it's right or not, I'm not sure, but it felt right. Number one, I had never been to this voting place before. Do you know what it's like going to the unknown? I mean, have you ever, like today, I'm coming here to speak. I don't know where room 114 is. I'm not even sure where the student union building totally is. And I'm in the parking garage over here, which is, when I finish parking, I'm looking for cheese. Because that is an incredible feat just to park in the parking garage. To get over here, to get to the room. And I'm thinking, wow, this is really quite a deal. And so it's the unknown. And the unknown is always a little nerve-wracking for us when we go into a place we've never been before. So it's the unknown. Number two, there were 3 precincts voting that day. What if I'd gotten in the wrong line? And I got to the head of the line, and the person who's manning the voting table that allows me to go vote says this: "You're in the wrong line." And everybody hears he's in the wrong line. He wasn't even smart enough to get in the right line to vote. We're going to let him pull a lever? And I know that's crazy. The front of the brain says, no big deal. I just go to the back of the brain, back of the line. But the kid in the back seat thinking, remember in 3rd grade when they did that to you? Remember in 5th grade when they said that to you? Remember the person in 7th grade? You know, he doesn't want me to re-experience those feelings, so he's just protecting. He's just doing his job. And that made sense to me. Now, the Lord has a wonderful sense of humor. When I went to vote the second time, I was ready. The second time Obama ran. I'm going back to the same place to vote. I know where I'm going. I got in the right line right away. No questions asked. Kid didn't even blink the night before. I get to the front of the line, and guess what happens? I'm in the right line, but the lady in the front of the line next to me isn't. She gets to the front of the line, and the person at the table says to her, for everybody to hear, "I'm sorry, you're in the wrong line." I think, oh no, now what? She turns to me, walks over to me, and says, "Can I cut in?" Now, I know exactly how she feels because I knew from before, I just wanted her to cut in. There wasn't any question about it, but I had a problem. I had a long line behind me. She said, I got to get to work. And the person behind me tapped me on the shoulder and said, I got to get to work too. I said, I'll tell you what, it's fine with me. Just ask all of them. She went to the back of the line. Now, whether that's right or wrong, I know how she felt. You know how she felt. And that was my kid trying to protect me from feeling that way. So that's how we're operating abnormally normally. Are you with me? Now, what if we also had a little guidance system in play? Like a GPS. Anybody here use your GPS? Nobody? I'm not saying exclusively, but you do use some, especially if you're driving in heavy traffic. Now, some of you probably have all the maps memorized, but I don't, so I use the GPS. Now, the GPS, as you well know, is not always 100% accurate. I have driven down some dead-end alleys before, or gotten some places and there wasn't anything there. Or has made me do a U-turn so many times that I've caught myself coming back the other way. And I'm sure you've had those kind of experiences. But most of the time, my GPS gives me satellite guidance that lets me know if there's traffic up ahead and I need to take an alternative route or whatever. Wouldn't it be nice if we had a GPS that could act that way in our brain, that could give us guidance, so that before we act, before we behave, before we do something that we may regret to do, it kicks in? Well, we do, or we potentially could. And we all have part of that. You know, there's their gut level feelings. Haven't you had the gut level feelings before that you shouldn't do something or you should do something? And you get this overwhelming sense that it doesn't make any sense, but I got to pay love on my gut. You know what I'm talking about? That's your GPS. That's your satellite. Now, depending upon where your GPS is aimed, is dependent upon your reception and how the quality and what you're going to get. We all have a GPS to a certain degree, but it may not always be fine-tuned spiritually, which is kind of where I want to walk next. And now we walk into the book of Romans. Are you familiar with the book of Romans? Chapter 7, verse 14 to 28. Paul gives a very interesting soliloquy. You can almost see him kind of like the thinker pondering. And he's saying, okay, why is it that I do what I don't want to do? Why can't I do what I do want to do? In fact, the more that I try to do what I want to do, the more I don't do that. And the more that I try not to do what I don't want to do, the more I do that. Therefore, it must not be me. It must be the kid in the back seat. That's a revised Dan version, just so you know. But that's what he's saying. There's something within me that compels me to do that. But then he goes on and he says this, I'm just so thankful that God doesn't condemn me for that. He understands me, he doesn't condemn me. But he doesn't excuse me, because then he says in the next 15 verses in Romans 8 that I need to change my GPS. That's what he says. It says it right in your Bible. Just read it. I need to change my GPS. What he says is the GPS that I typically follow is one that's based upon my human nature. And the GPS I have to follow is one that's based on my spiritual nature. So I got to change my satellite reception. So what I'm getting now is about 16 times in the 8th chapter of Romans, in the first 15 verses, he talks about learning to walk by the Spirit and not by the flesh. In other words, I want to have my satellite imagery focused on God so that I can listen to God and not just to my human nature. And those things often won't make any sense because the things of God frequently don't make any sense. I was talking with a friend the other day who's age 70. He's a retired railroad engineer. And he shared this story with me, and I asked his permission to share the story, and he said I could. He said when he was 23, he became a Christ follower. He said when he was 26, as a railroad engineer, he woke up one morning, and he had this overwhelming, profound feeling that he could not go in that day to work. He said, I was physically healthy. I felt fine. But it's just an overwhelming feeling that I couldn't go in that day to work. He said, I prayed about it. I didn't know what to do. I finally called in. I said, I can't come in today. They said, fine, no problem. We'll reschedule you. He said, it made no sense to me at the time. He said, later on that day, I heard that 2 trains had collided in Lima, Ohio. And the engineer on the train that I had been on died. And the one sitting next to him lost his legs. Now, that doesn't mean that God was mad at them and he was okay with that. I don't know the story of the other 2. I don't know why that happened. What I do know is he was listening through his satellite image, through his God positioning system, GPS, to what God had to say in his gut, which made no sense to his prefrontal cortex. Are you with me? And as we engage in the disciplines of prayer and meditation and scripture and fellowship, we enhance the ability of our GPS, our God positioning system, to hear and listen so we receive those signals. End on this story. I was working with an attorney one time who came in, and he had come in because he had got his first DUI. Now, DUIs aren't good for anybody to get, but if you're an attorney and you get a DUI, not only is that a problem, you may lose your law license. And his partners and his wife said, you've got to go get counseling. So he came in for counseling, and we worked together for a while. And he came in one day, and a lot of his issues were he would drink under stress. And so we began to work on learning to listen to God and focusing his GPS and listening to the Holy Spirit and some of the spiritual disciplines. And he said one day, he says, how would I live my life in such a way that I could follow Christ? I said, well, you need to begin to ask this one simple question. God, what do you want me to do today? Or what do you want me to do right now? He said, and then what? He's an attorney, and then what? I said, and then you listen. He said, and then what? God's going to go booga, booga, booga? I said, no, you listen. Scripture says, my sheep know my voice. It may be a prompting, it may be a direction, it may be a sensitivity. It may not be you won't go to work today, but you'll get a direction of some kind if you're quiet, if you listen, if you meditate, if you become quiet before God. If you're satellite tuned, and as a Christ follower, you're listening. He says, and he left. He came back a couple weeks later, and in attorney speak, he said, what I'm about to tell you is off the record. And I would deny it in a court of law. And furthermore, I think you're certifiable. He says, but I think I now am as well. And I said, well, what happened? He said, I went back to my office and I thought about your stuff and nonsense. It made no sense to me. I work in facts, facts, facts. And you're telling me that I have to sit there and listen for God's direction. Do you have any idea how much my time is worth? I said, no, not a clue. Let me put it this way. I went in my office on a Monday morning and I shut the door. And I got behind my desk. I didn't want anybody to see me. And I prayed and I said, okay, Lord, what do you want me to do now? Do you have any idea how long 5 minutes is? Do you know how much 5 minutes costs on my rate? I'm supposed to be billing somebody. Do you have any idea how long 10 minutes is? 15. He said, when I hit 20 minutes, I was ready to make a new door in my office. He said, at that moment, I got this overwhelming urge to work on a case that wasn't due for a month. He said, if you walk into my office, what you'll see is my desk, and behind me is a big credenza that's stacked with files upon files upon files upon files. It's totally organized chaos. I know where everything is. Don't mess with my files. He said, I had a court case that I had to work on for that day. That this is Monday. We're going to court on Thursday. And we had to tell the clerk of courts we were going to be ready for that case by noon. So I didn't work on that case. I felt compelled to work on a case on this stack all the way to the end at the bottom, which made no sense to me whatsoever. But I'm listening. You're certifiable, but I'm listening. He said, I finished that case. Said two things happened. It's very interesting to me. Number one, I had fun practicing law. He said the case came together beautifully. It was really fun. I enjoyed myself. He said the second thing that happened was I wasn't ready for court for the other case. My secretary opened the door. She said, I'm going to lunch. You've been in here a long time today. Would you like me to bring you a sandwich? And I said, yeah, I'm trying to wrap up that case for Thursday. She says, oh, by the way, the clerk of court's called, and the attorney on the other side said they need a stay on that case, so they won't be ready by Thursday. I said, wow. And she says, oh, and he said, by the way, it's probably too soon to ask you this, but there's another case that they want to bring in that the other attorney's ready for if by chance you have time. He said, what case would that be? Can you guess which case it was? It was the one he spent the morning working on. He said it didn't work this way all the time, but he said what it confirmed to me is that there was somebody else in control. There was another person, a being, an entity, if I was willing to listen to what comes next or what comes now was in control. One of the things that I brought with me today is a book that any of you are welcome to take. It's not my book. It's written by a local author called Next Best Step. It illustrates some of the points that I've talked about today and some others that he writes about. Feel free, they're free. Pick them up if you want to on the end when you leave. And if you have any questions, I'd be happy to take. Do we have a couple minutes to answer questions? Okay. If you have questions, I'd be happy to try to answer them. I've already rambled on. I'm already tired of listening to myself speak. I've spoken more today than I probably have in 2 years. So let me try to answer any questions you might have.
I came across a study in Time magazine recently that I found fascinating. It was, they were looking at mental and physical stress. And do you want me to wait?
Yeah, why don't you do that?
Okay. I came across a study recently in Time magazine where they had studied mental and physical stress and how forgiveness by a person affects that. And they found that it was people who forgave themselves and others had zero negative effects from stress. So I was wondering if you could, does anything come to your mind of how that would happen in the brain? And also how forgiveness, if you don't have that, it's like a trauma playing over and over again. Or does forgiveness wipe out that trauma that the brain would make?
Everybody understand her question? Very interesting question that she's hit upon, which is the role of forgiveness in the brain. How does it affect us related to stress? And if we do forgive or if we don't forgive, and if we do forgive, does that eliminate the trauma? Well, it's a very complex question that you're asking. Forgiveness actually kind of takes place all over the brain. And now we're talking about forgiveness. We're not talking about restoration. Restoration involves two people. Forgiveness involves one person. I can forgive somebody that may or may not restore the relationship. They may or may not feel like being restored, or they may or may not feel like they've done anything wrong. But if I'm harboring something against them, does it behoove me to forgive them? Forgiveness tends to take place on the right side of the brain in the front. That's the navigator. The navigator has all these beliefs and expectations and so forth. And so the navigator then, when we forgive, it's an intentional process. I'm looking at somebody who's done me wrong, which I've actually stored that as a memory in the back, and some kind of trauma that I have. So now I've got this little movie that I can play, and when I play it, I see the event, and I feel the experience, the emotion that's associated with that event, of what he or she or they did to me. Bullying would be an example. I get people in now who are applying for disability because as children they were bullied. And the bullying was traumatic enough that they've stored these events. And so now when they try to deal or interact with other people in their daily life, they're hypersensitive, hypervigilant, and traumatized, so it's hard for them to work with them. So your first question is, does it cause stress? Absolutely. If they would go through a forgiveness process, which is intentional on the right side of the brain, would that help reduce stress? Absolutely. Would that cancel out the memory? No. Now they have to deal with the back of the brain. And there is a way to deal with that. In fact, research is showing us increasingly that we can actually edit those memories as movies in the back of the brain. And when we do at the cellular level, because it's stored as a little chemical DVD, it actually decodes or unencrypts that memory. And they can do that. But it's a two-step process. So forgiveness is absolutely necessary. But it won't necessarily change the fact that they forget. And oftentimes you find yourself in that situation where you think, I forgave that person. Why can't I let that go? And I get this all the time where a spouse will come in and they'll say, I forgave my spouse for fill in the blank, but I just can't get over what happened. And that's a part of the back seat that has the kid in the back that's trying to protect you from ongoing pain. In fact, what we know is when you have a significant emotional event, whether it's pleasurable or painful, it's stored. But the chemical that's secreted for the pleasurable event is only half the amount as the one for the painful event. Now, why is that? Because it's necessary to remember the painful events. It's nice to remember the pleasurable events. And so it encodes it and encrypts it, and so it's more difficult to get rid of. Does that make sense? Okay. Any other questions or thoughts?
I spent decades as a executive and manager, particularly in the IT area. I'm not a techie, but I enjoy the human side of it. And so I ended up with, if you know anything about IT people, they're a broad range of people who don't want to talk to anybody all the way up to people who want to serve people. And then I have my customer base. I always enjoyed the aspect of figuring out why I was having a problem either with an employee or with one of my customers. But the one I could never figure out, and I talked to a counseling friend of mine, he had a name for it as a learned behavior, was where somebody wants to hold on to the negatives related to another person and would not sum in the positives for a net sum. They always hang on to the negative, and therefore it's like walking through a minefield with that person. Because if you say anything related to the negative, or act like it, or even raise your eyebrow, you get this explosion. But if you do anything positive, it is not summed against what you just did. And I could never reconcile that. Now that you're talking about the child in the back, I'm wondering how that relates.
Wow. Heavy question. Let me take a couple minutes and maybe see if I can address some of it. I know it's far too complicated to address the whole piece, and so I'm afraid my answer is not going to be that sufficient or that succinct, but I'll try to do the best that I can. There's several pieces to what you're just asking. Part of it is personality. And so the question then comes, well, where does that come from? What is personality? Where does it come from? Most researchers, most psychologists, most social scientists would suggest that probably half or more of who we are is genetic. And we might label that temperament. We're just born that way. So we have certain predispositions. I like to think of people falling into two broad categories. People who tend to fight for survival and people who tend to flight for survival. Now, we all have both tendencies because we all have the fight-flight mechanism or freeze or whatever mechanism is there. But the fight mechanism or the flight mechanism tends to give us a genetic predisposition. So, for example, my son, who has 3 of my grandkids, has twins, a boy and a girl. And they're 3. And it's really fun to watch because Chloe is a fighter by nature. And her brother, because they're not identical, if you can kind of catch, is a flighter by nature. So she wants to charge in where no man should go. And he's not going anywhere. And it's been that way since birth. It's not in no developmental experiences yet. That's just what's happening. Now you compound that with their developmental experiences, and now you begin to get personality. So we begin to add to it. Suffice it to say that each of us have certain personality types within us, components of both the genetic temperament and the typology based upon our developmental experiences, and those are stored in the back of the brain. Now you combine that with coming up against another automobile, another personality, another person who has got their own set of genetic temperaments and types and so forth. And what you find is kind of interesting. The first thing you find is, have you ever been in a situation where you walk into a room and you like somebody and you don't even know them? Have you been in that situation? I just like them. Have you been in the same situation? You walk in a room and you go, ugh, I don't want to have anything to do with this person. It's the old, what's going on? We've got these certain personalities that we have difficulty with and other personalities that we don't, and it varies. It's not the same personality for everybody. So it varies based upon our temperament, type, and experiences. So coming back to what your situation was, I don't really know who that person was that you were doing with why, but you're right. Something in the back is kicking in and causing you to react and setting up warning signals that's saying, this personality for you, not this person, this personality for you is difficult or trouble. And so you got to watch, kind of tread on eggshells when you're dealing with them. Does that make sense?
Yeah, but the main question is, why do that type of person, and I wish I could remember what this counselor told me that type of personality was, this learned behavior. Why would some people tend to dote on the negatives and not bring the positives of the same situation and to net it out?
He's talking about certain personality typologies, which is beyond what we can get here. Basically, simply put, there are about 12 personality types. I like to look at them as when Jesus called the 12 disciples, he called one of each personality type. And I think he did. But we all have a combination of each. Do we have any math people in here? So that's 12 factorial. What is that real quick? It's about 6 billion. So that's like no two snowflakes are alike. So you're going to have some primary, there are certain personalities that tend to be negative, to answer your question. But they also have other personality factors in. We have to kind of think that part of our role, our job as people, is to learn how to get along with every personality type regardless of who they are. They may respond negatively because they may see the glass half empty as opposed to an optimistic type that sees the glass half full. Part of their personality, not good or bad, just who they are.
That's a good point. One thing I did observe in every one of these types of people, they were always glasses half empty people.
And frequently the glasses half empty people, research shows, tend to be more accurate. Just not healthier.
I may be asking too much here for the time we've got left, but what if there's a person that can't figure out what the movie is that's playing, Dan, and how do you try to get at that? And secondly, can you talk just a minute about, you mentioned that people can edit those movies. Can you talk just briefly about how the process that's done?
Well, it happens all the time that people can't get to the movies for a variety of reasons. Sometimes there is associated trauma that goes along with it. Frequently, I'll find people who have blocked out significant parts of their life. I've worked with people who can't remember anything below the age of 12. Because if they do, the pain just would come flooding back. So they've just blocked that whole area of their life out. Or they've blocked out memories around the trauma. You also have to remember that when the trauma occurs, it occurs the age that the person is, so they'll have a perceptual set at that age. The adult brain may look at that and say, well, that shouldn't have been a traumatic event or experience, but to the child it can be very traumatic. Sometimes it's just a matter of working down. The memories seem to be almost encoded like a DNA strand. You know what I'm talking about, where they're kind of looped? So when you hit on one memory, it seems to leak into the next memory, which seems to take you down to the next memory, which seems to take you down to the next memory. So typically when we do memory work, the easiest way to do it is to ask people to go back through their memories from earliest childhood memory to now and just write down how it made them feel. Picture the memory, because they're pictures, and the associated emotion. Sad, mad, bad, glad, or what we call mixed, which is kind of a combination of one of the other negative emotions and a happy emotion. So I went to a birthday party and it made me feel really good, but at the end of the party, something happened that made me feel bad. So I was age 7. And then we'll see, like, birthday parties tend to be clustered together. Most researchers, in my experience, also suggest that most people have 30 to 40 of these significant emotional events or memories in their brain. And so when I have them do this work, typically they'll come in with average between 20 and 40 of these memories that we tend to look at. Occasionally I'll have somebody come in with 128, and I think, wait a minute, what's going on here? But most of the time, they'll have about 30 to 40. And so then we'll begin to work with the memories. And as we work with the memories, and I don't really have time to get into how we actually do that today, but as we work with the memories, we actually can edit them just like you edit a movie. So the little girl who was thrown from the car, what does she see today? She sees herself quietly sitting alongside the road. That's what she actually sees. That part of the brain does not know the difference between real and imagined. And so if it perceives that it could happen, it actually encodes or stores it as a memory, even if it hasn't happened. Which sounds funny. How can you have a memory of something that hasn't happened? But that's where we get the panic attacks and the anxiety from, which is a sense of something could happen, so we go ahead and store it as an event, even though it hasn't happened. Are we good?
And we've got maybe time for one more quick question. Does anybody have another question?
Go ahead.
You can buy GPS, but then do we really can buy GPS?
Say it again.
If we need a GPS, we can buy it, right? We can purchase, spend money, but the type of GPS you talk, can we buy it? So how do you cultivate it? That's my, is there anything that the technique that you can cultivate? You cannot buy it, how do you get it?
How do you get the GPS? Great question. And you can't buy it. It's already been paid for. We just have to accept the gift. Christ already paid for that. And so it's a matter of just opening that up and being sensitive as Christ followers and allowing the Holy Spirit to speak to us. It's already been bought and paid. That's the wonderful thing. We couldn't afford it. Not this one. Our satellite would blow up before it left the launch pad like the other day.
It's okay. That's a great way to end.
Okay, great. Well, let's thank Dan for coming today.